We are starting our webinar now, and it's my pleasure and honor to greet everybody. My name is Andrius Kubilius. I'm a member of European Parliament, and this is our traditional seminar of Friends of European Russia forum, and today we have a very interesting debate with two prominent leaders of Russian opposition, Garry Kasparov and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, also joined by Roland Frondenstein and myself. And why we decided to do that seminar, because quite recently, at the beginning of, on January 20th, both Garry Kasparov and Mikhail Khodorkovsky published very interesting and important article in Foreign Affairs, Don't Fear Putin's Demise. That is the title of an article, which speaks very clearly about possibilities of democracy after Russia will be defeated in Ukraine. I will not elaborate anymore on that. And this is really what is important in our today's life and in our strategic forecast on the future of Russia. So as usually, this is a webinar where, first of all, speakers will speak, and the whole discussion will be moderated by our traditional moderator, very tough moderator, Konstantin Egert. And everybody should know that there is translation available, so it's possible to have also Russian language. And the last technical remark, as always, your questions are very much and comments are very much welcome, but they should be put in a written in chat on our webinar. So we shall try to answer. So now, really, it's my pleasure to ask to take moderation into his hands. Konstantin Egert, take the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrius. Good afternoon, доброго дня, добрый день, labadiana. I will be your guide for the next hour and 27 minutes, a very sometimes quite tough guide, because we have a big audience, we have very important speakers, and we have not a lot of time. A bit on the technical side. We'll start with brief remarks by the panelists, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Garry Kasparov, Andrius Kubilius, and Roland Frondenstein in this order. Then there will be a discussion which I will moderate, but you can ask questions. Questions should be asked in the chat that you see under the main screen. There will be no questions taken in audio, essentially. So you just write the questions in the chat. I'll see them, or Monte and others will help me to draw my attention to these questions. I don't see them. I will try to bring as many questions as possible to the panelists. Now, without further ado, we'll start with Mr. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of the co-authors of the famous piece in Foreign Affairs. Mikhail Borisovich, the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes.
I welcome all the participants and the panel. I'm going to be speaking only about the bullet points that seem evident to me, but I'm not going to justify them and to explain them. I'm going to leave it for the Q&A session. The thing is that the persons who are here are quite qualified ones. Putin will lose the war, but possibly the war will be lost by him right in the fight against NATO. It is impossible to invent a model of ending the war, or reaching peace in the war, that would not deteriorate significantly the standing of Ukraine if the war relapses after 2024. Since the defeat in the war ultimately is possible only through the demise of the Putin's regime, then the significant issue is what will be after the regime. There are two key pathways, and the selection of them can be impacted by the West. The first pathway is collapse, full disintegration of Russia, to break down into 5 to 7 independent states. And the second pathway is preserving Russia, mostly within the borders that we know for today, perhaps with a few pieces left aside, as this has been described, and there will be a real federation and a parliamentary model of rule to be established. So this choice is in fact to be done both by the Russians and by the West. My choice is the second pathway, and I'm going to justify it if needed. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your brevity. I just wanted to ask one question to clarify what you said to the audience. Is the fall of the Putin regime, or will the fall of the Putin regime be the result of the defeat in the war, or there is the sequence is different? The Putin's regime falls for some reason, and then the war is lost by Russia.
Это невозможно предсказать.
This is impossible to foresee, because the demise of the regime significantly depends on the personality of Putin. If Putin makes an excuse and leaves earlier, then no military defeat will be needed to happen to Russia today.
Gary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think it's a very important moment where we can share our thoughts with this distinguished audience. Again, I'll try to be brief to leave more meat for Q&A session, for the discussion. But I think it's very important to emphasize that while our article is analyzing hypotheticals, and we heard many complaints and criticism about naivety, it's not the best plan for the future of Russia after Putin's defeat in Ukraine and collapse of his regime. It's the only suggestion to get Russia out of this geopolitical catastrophe, and the only plan to offer Russia as a state a hope in the future. We based our analysis on an obvious fact that this war would be lost by Russia, and this defeat would signal the beginning of a new era, as happened many times in Russian history. A geopolitical catastrophe and military defeats led to revolts and revolutions. We cannot predict all the consequences of this collapse, and we wanted to address the fears, very often irrational fears, of Western statesmen, Western politicians, political pundits, who are often use this argument, keep using this argument of unpredictability of collapse of Putin's regime, and inevitable collapse of Russian state, Russian empire, as a factor that should prevent Ukrainian outright military victory, because it could lead to chaos in Russia, it could lead to a rise of China, and many other things that they couldn't calculate. So we think that these arguments should be thrown away, and we should concentrate on the priorities. Priority is necessary condition for peace in Ukraine, in the region, in the world. It's a demise of Putin regime. That's why we say do not fear the demise of Putin regime. As long as Putin stays in power, Russia is doomed to continue these wars, because that's the logic of any empire. Empire can survive only with expansion. Economy is no longer an issue, it's no longer a factor, and so Putin will rely on military campaigns. If it's not Ukraine, he'll find other targets. So that's why we believe that the only hope for the future of Russia is to look into the opportunities that will be presented to us after the collapse of Putin regime following the military defeat. That's why the motto that we suggest it should be used by Russian opposition, it's victory for Ukraine, freedom for Russia. The end of occupation of Ukraine will be the beginning of liberation of Russia from Putin's fascism. Again, we do not know whether Russia could be preserved as one state. Maybe it's unlikely. Maybe there will be some parts of Russia would like to go on their own. We can see now the rise of these national feelings in many regions like Tatarstan or Bashkortostan, and also some of the Russian regions in the northwest, like in Germanlandia. They are also dreaming about independence. Whether it's going to happen or not remains to be seen. But sooner Ukraine wins, better our chances to preserve the core of Russia and offer Russia opportunity to get reintegrated into European, Euro-Atlantic geopolitical space. Thank you.
Really, you're breaking all the records in terms of your brief introductory speeches. That's very unusual. Thank you very much. I will then give the floor to Andrius, and then Roland is finishing, and then we'll start our debate. Andrius, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, Konstantin, I am not so sure that I will be able to follow such a brief, example, since we politicians, parliamentarians, were paid salaries to speak, that's our job. So, but again, I will start from really both, congratulating and also saying that I was very much impressed by this article of both of Gary and Mikhail. And, since they were much coincided with my own, thoughts, which I also wrote into several articles, with very clear titles. One was, "What does the West want?" And second one, recently published, "How the West will help democracy in Russia." Why, it's important for us really to speak exactly and to discuss what Mikhail and Gary were writing or were speaking here. Because we need to, at least in my own understanding, democracy in Russia is needed not only for Russian people. It's very much needed for all Europeans, for all the European continent. Because this is a condition to have, peace, stable peace on the European continent. This is very, very clear. Democracies are not fighting each other. Authoritarian Russia, as we have seen, as we saw, really started military aggression against Ukraine, and that is why NATO in Madrid Declaration wrote in a very clear way that authoritarian Russia is the biggest threat to European security. So for us, it's important not only to look how to deter and how to defend ourselves against such a threat, but also what can we do in order to, to diminish that threat. And here is exactly transformation of Russia to democracy is very much important. Now, the question is, of course, how such a democracy can be achieved in Russia. And of course, that will be done by Russian people. But in order to achieve, of course, Russian opposition needs to have a strategy, and also the Western community needs to have a strategy how to assist Russian people. And here I would say that, unfortunately, for time being, I do not see that the West has very clear strategy. There are a lot of, efforts spent on describing different scenarios. And like Gary have said, some scenarios which are discussed in the West are, in some way, are making the Western capitals afraid of possible consequences of the Ukrainian victory. And that is why, I agree with Mikhail and Gary that that can influence in a negative way how much Western is ready to deliver weapons to Ukraine. Because if in the Western capitals there will be too much of worries about the impact of Ukrainian victory to the future of Russian development, if there will be, if the prevalent scenario in the Western capitals will be that Russia will go to collapse, into very dangerous collapse, of course, then Western deliveries can, we can expect that Western deliveries of the weapons will not be on that scale which we would like to see. So that is why we need not only to speak about the possibility of democracy in Russia, but we need to speak about the strategies, how such a democracy can be achieved after, of course, after Ukrainian victory, after Putin regime will be gone. And here I see several issues which were written into Mikhail and Gary's article. Mikhail have spoken about possibility to have Russia as a parliamentarian statehood with strong regional powers. That is exactly what perhaps is possible to achieve. But besides that, I would say that from my point of view, we need to have from the Western point of view, we need to have a strategy how we can assist Russian people really to abandon their dream to restore empire and to get a new dream of a normal European type of life in Russia itself. In order to help Russian people to abandon the dream of restoration of empire, I see three major points. One is, of course, Ukrainian victory. Second is tribunal to Putin. And the third point is Ukraine membership in NATO, which would show to Russian people that, forget about imperial dreams. Ukraine is gone. On how to assist Russian people to get some kind of stronger dream of normal life in Russia, I would see two major points. One really is that starting from now, EU needs to, together with Russian opposition, needs to develop a clear draft of the strategy, what kind of relationship will be built in between of EU and democratic Russia. Something like free trade, visa-free, new type of association agreement, or something more, in order really to help Russia after transformation to stabilize its own democracy, like it was done with Marshall Plan after Second World War, in all the Western Europe, with very clear goal to assist those countries, in stabilization of their democracies and not to allow Putin to increase his influence through the local communists. And second point for that, positive dream issue, I would mention that good example of Ukrainian success again can have an important inspirational influence on Russian people. And Ukrainian success can be created only through its possibility for Ukraine not only to win the war, but also to integrate itself into European Union. In all the Central Europe, in all the post-Soviet area, there is no another example that any country left alone without integration towards EU was able to create success, and that is why this integration, which we are pushing forward, also is important not only for Ukraine itself, but also for much broader consequences, including, possibility to influence developments in Russia. So that could be, the backbone of Western strategy, how the West can assist, Russian people in the transformation of their country back to more democratic, and more normal type of development. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Andrews. Lots of questions after you spoke, including, for example, changing the mind of the Russians regarding future developments. But for now, I'd like to give the floor now to Roland Freudenstein, who represents GlobSec. It's Europe, kind of Brussels branch of GlobSec. Roland, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kostya. Thanks for having me. Yeah, since I agree with practically everything that's been said, let me tackle this fundamental question: can Russia become a democracy? And some of my best friends, not myself, but some of my best friends would feel reminded of the old Orminsky Radio joke, the Radio Yerevan joke: can Switzerland become a socialist country? The answer is, в принципе, да. In principle, yes, but what a pity about the beautiful mountains. Now, the reverse of this is what some people would answer to this question: can Russia become a democracy? Nevertheless, I would split it up into two questions and give my immediate answers to them. First question: is there any nation on earth that by some God-given law cannot become a democracy? My answer is no. Second question: is transforming Russia into a parliamentary or presidential democracy going to be difficult, full of pitfalls, full of backsliding possibilities, and so on? My answer: you bet it is. But I think these two fundamental questions and answers, I think we need to keep in our minds when we discuss what we're discussing today. So, second point I want to make: the Western fears connected to the further development of Russia's war in Ukraine. I think they break down into two fields, and they have been mentioned, but I want to systematize it a little bit. So one fear goes into the escalation direction, meaning that that Russia will escalate against Ukraine with even more brutal warfare, possibly tactical nuclear weapons. I'm not saying how rational this fear is. I'm just describing that it's there, and we need to take it into account. The second one concerns a direct confrontation, military confrontation between NATO and Russia, which then will also inevitably, in the eyes of those skeptics of supporting Ukraine, will inevitably end up in global thermonuclear war. And there are some very interesting examples of comments and op-eds written recently in Western countries. And the other stream of fears and apprehensions concerns exactly the chaos, the unpredictability, the instability, but maybe even the concrete total collapse, a civil war or something that is connected to the demise of Putin in the eyes of those skeptics. Now, I think both these fears are to a large extent responsible for the hesitations that we witness time and again in the debates in the West about arms deliveries to Ukraine, generally support for Ukraine, or also the few clear cases where someone in the West pronounces the R word, in other words, regime change, which you guys here have had no qualms in making the cornerstone of actually peace in Europe in the future, in Eurasia. But many people in the West, as you know, strongly hesitate to even spell it out, let alone promote regime change in Moscow. And this is precisely because the end of the Putin regime, as dangerous as Putin is meanwhile seen by even the governments in Paris and Berlin, the end of the Putin regime is still fraught with this danger of Russia breaking apart, and this is seen as a huge risk to world peace and to our own security and peace. Now, having said this, I mean, just last sub point to the second point I made. Of course, there is progress in the Western debate. I mean, I'll give you one example.
Roland, you only have 1 minute. I'm really sorry.
That's okay. Fine. A year ago, it was almost impossible to say that we have to defend peace and security in Europe against Russia. The mantra was peace and security can only be had together with and in cooperation with Russia. This is gone. The German Social Democrats have officially now said goodbye to that doctrine, and they use the formula against Russia. And the third point is very brief that I want to make is, if we make the case that it's in everybody's, including the West's interest, that Russia loses the war, and that Putin has to leave the Kremlin, maybe not alive even, in whatever physical state, then we have to argue with national interest, and that is that includes not labeling everybody who says something different a Russian agent or a Kremlin stooge and an instrument. So we need to argue politically, we need to argue with our self-interest, we need to argue on the basis of analysis of Putin's behavior and scenarios of the future. And that includes scenarios of the terrible things that will happen if Putin looks like winning this war or getting anything positive out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roland. There are questions pouring in. I have to be, I'm terribly sorry, not very polite, just to tell Mr. Fellinger that essentially you are spamming the chat. It's very difficult for me and for others to insert questions if you publish something every 30 seconds. I will try and condense everything you said in essentially one question. You advocate a breakup of Russia into 34 states. By 34, we'll leave it kind of aside. Your question to the participants, and as far as I understand, mostly to Mr. Khodorkovsky and to Mr. Kasparov, is whether the breakup of Yugoslavia could serve as an example for breaking up Russia. So Gary or Mikhail, who wants to answer?
Okay. As we stated several times, some of the parts of current Russian Federation may decide to go on their own. Now, 34, this number 34, we heard many times. I think it's a made-up number. So I don't think we have nothing even close to this number. We naturally look for some of the regions that had strong national aspirations. They manifested back in 1991 during the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's Tatarstan, to less extent Bashkortostan, Chechnya. But as for total collapse of Russia into this mosaic of states, I think it's absolute fantasy. Yes, we know that people in Far East, the Russians, ethnic Russians, have different views or different economic interests from Russian people living in the northwest of Russia. But everything will depend on an ability of a new democratic government to offer conditions that will make it more attractive to stay together. there are no traditions of national statehood, and that's why Yugoslavia is a really bad example, because that was a state that was brought together after World War I, and there were very different backgrounds. Of half of the country lived in the West, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and half came from the East, and it also had a very strong core of Serbian nationalism as the connected element. So I think that we could easily avoid this catastrophic scenario if there are conditions that will offer Russian people an opportunity to look into the future with confidence. And as we stated in the article, the choices, they're not many. In fact, the choice is simple. Two scenarios. While weak and divided Russia eventually fall into the hands of Chinese imperialism, or we find our way by meeting all the demands of free world to get back into Euro-Atlantic geopolitical space and recall our European roots. Let's not forget, Russia had European traditions. Actually, it's the Novgorod Republic, Pskov Republic. Yeah, I wouldn't call Kiev's roots, but technically, this is the beginning of Russia as a state. Started in the Western sphere. So that's why I would refer to what Mr. Kubilius said. It's this: what will increase chances for this kind of transformation is a Western policy. Instead of playing ostrich and trying to hide from the inevitable outcome of this war, Putin's defeat and the collapse of his regime, the free world has to come up with a plan that will help us, through Russian patriots, to offer this opportunity for Russians to recall our European roots. While majority of Russians may not be embracing values of the free world by heart, definitely they will embrace them by stomach.
Thank you very much, Gary. I actually would like to address now to Mikhail and to you another question from a good friend of mine from Tbilisi, Vaja Tavberidze. His question is a very simple dichotomy choice. Which of the following two scenarios, assuming other options aren't available, do not exist, would be preferable for Mr. Khodorkovsky and Mr. Kasparov? Victory of Russia in Ukraine or dissolution of Russia as a result of defeat in Ukraine? Again, only two choices. Russia wins the war, or Russia loses the war, but as a result of it, it collapses. What will you choose? That's Tavberidze, Mikhail, probably to start answering.
Я ужасно не люблю, когда
I hate when I'm offered the dichotomic choice. Who do you prefer to kill among your children? Nobody. So, in this case, I would prefer to die myself. Therefore, you shouldn't offer options if both options are bad. I am totally convinced that right now we are speaking about a real option when, through the victory of Ukraine, or if the West unfortunately prefers not to assist Ukraine to the extent needed, but to fight itself, because Putin is not going to stop the war, then through the defeat of NATO, in this case, there will be a possibility to preserve Russia. There will be a possibility not to take the pathway of Yugoslavia, which will be needed by no one in the case of nuclear scenario, and without special efforts, without special provoking of collapse of Russia, disintegration of Russia. Russia, as Gary Kasparov said, has all chances to keep its state.
If you want to add something, specifically to what, something new to what Mikhail said, then do. If you are in general agreement, we'll move on. We have lots of questions and lots.
We can move on, because I couldn't agree more that it's a demagogical choice, and that's exactly what we're trying to prove. So that's the collapse of Putin's Russia does not lead necessarily to dissolution of the state, and that's exactly what we're trying to work out.
Here we have several questions coming from Guy Holland, and they are essentially, they boil down to this idea that you have to change the Russian psyche, the psychology of Russians, that there are perceptions, again, I'm just reading out, there are perceptions that Russians do like strong authority, do like strong leaders. In Russian society, democracy is basically has a bad name. Essentially, it's been compromised by the last 30 years. So how do you go about changing Russian attitudes, even if Putin loses the war? Again, that's from Guy Holland. Who wants to answer, and maybe we'll also the next questions will be more to Roland. So, Mikhail or Gary, any comments on that, on the psychology of Russians?
Очередь Гарри начинать.
Okay.
Maybe Gary will go first.
It's Gary that's starting.
As for psychology, so we don't know exactly what majority of our competitors thinking now, because all the polls, and I saw the reference to Levada and other polls, they could not be trusted simply because I believe 90% of Russians simply refuse to answer the question. Yes, I'm not trying to go against the facts that only a minority in Russia protested against the war in the beginning of this full-blown invasion. And we may probably say that 10 to 15% of our compatriots, they were against the war on moral grounds. The majority probably didn't care. But as I already said, Russia, unlike Soviet Union, has been fully integrated into the global economy. And whether people like democracy or not, and it's an endless debate, because democracy meant many different things for Russian people. And unfortunately, thanks to the Western support to Putin in his first years, many people believe that Putin was democracy, because Putin brought prosperity to Russia. Russia became stable, growing economy, and Putin was a part of so-called G8. So that's why Putin brought prosperity that was associated with democracy. And that's why, again, I would set an issue of democracy, separately from what we're discussing now. And we should do actually the same trick. If the only chance for Russia to recover economically, and it's getting close to economic collapse, and so the numbers, official Russian numbers, with a deficit and with a loss of income, official Russian numbers. So the European choice, Euro-Atlantic, I would say, choice should be the only one, because the alternative is China. And for many Russians, by the way, the potential threat of China and Islamic radicalism is far more relevant issues than the NATO. As of now, during the war, difficult to convince people otherwise, because unfortunately, many of them, following Russian propaganda, believe that Putin is winning or about to win the war. And Putin is fighting the war against NATO. That's also answering some of the questions. Yeah, what will happen? This is World War III. Putin is fighting.
I will use the opportunity, Gary. I'm terribly sorry, but you disappeared. I mean, I don't hear you and don't see you, but I see two hands raised, Roland and Andrews. I haven't seen who was the first, but I'll give it first to Roland.
Thanks. Okay, just about this question of what about the Russian mindset and the soul of the Russian citizens? Look, countries can reinvent themselves. And arguably, it's happened to Germany and Japan after World War II. Now, the circumstances were very particular. There was occupation in both cases. But what really counted was that there was a core of people in the respective countries. There was a group of Japanese that deeply believed that their country could and should become a constitutional parliamentary democracy. And the same, of course, was the case with Germany, which all differences between Germany and Japan taken into account. So countries can, given the political will and given the right circumstances and given the totality of defeat, which must be obvious to everyone, can change themselves. And so I would argue that, yes, this is possible, of course, in Russia's case. Now, we're probably not going to see an occupation. So that element needs to be taken into account. On the other hand, you know, I mean, by the end of Imperial Japan, there were millions of Japanese that were readily willing to die for the emperor because they were brainwashed. Now, this is not going to be the case in Russia. You know, the other side of the coin of the lack of open resistance against the regime at the moment and open resistance against the war at the moment, the other side of that coin is that not many people in Russia are going to take to the streets, let alone die for Putinism, right? And I think that's good news. And so we can pretty safely assume that the large mass of the people is going to remain very passive in this whole thing. And given the right set of instruments, and I think Gary and Mikhail have developed this, and Mikhail has also written the book How to Slay a Dragon, which treats all of these questions of how to get to the end of the regime, but especially what to do afterwards in detail. I mean, I think all these deliberations and plans are extremely important, and I find them credible.
Roland, thank you very much. I will ask Andreas to hold for a bit because a few things you said. Actually, I would like immediately to readdress or channel to Mikhail with two questions which I think are related and which I think to a large extent are relevant because Mikhail probably understands how the Russian regime works slightly better than a lot of us because he really mixed with these people in his life. So this idea, first of all, Mikhail, the idea that the majority of Russians will not support Putin. So essentially, the majority of Russians will be passive, no matter what happens inside Russia, be it defeat, be it regime change or something else. That's what Roland mentioned. And there are two questions which I think are related. One is from Katarina. What event or who could initiate a democratic reform process in Russia? What should make the power holders, the regime and its economic supporters want a genuine democracy, whether it's with Putin or rather without Putin, as far as I understand. And second question, which links to that, is from Движение за права человека, from Oleg. One of the most important and influential forces inside Russia is the FSB, the secret police. How can, well, I mean, the future reform movement make itself safe from this organization? How it can essentially eliminate the influence of FSB? So I try to group it into this kind of what to do.
Well, first of all, I would argue that democracy in Russia is a bad word in Russia. Of course not. I would rather agree with Gary that democracy in Russia is perceived by the majority of Russians differently from the standard textbook on democracy. It has been cursed, but let's speak about it other times. The process, there can be many events that can provoke democratic reforms in Russia, but all of them are classical ones and understandable. First of all, there should be a split in the elites. Second, the new power coming to power should happen through a non-military process. There shouldn't be a mass-scale military fight. In my view, these are the two key prerequisites when democratic changes, reforms, can happen. I can explain the reasons, but this is a matter for a long discussion, and I have already described it in my book. Now, regarding the Federal Security Service, FSB, I don't know any large nation to exist without a national security office or some office on protecting constitution or something similar, doing similar jobs. Therefore, when we speak about the necessity to liquidate FSB, we are not speaking about an attempt to get out of the trend, this pathway of development of governance where such an office should be anyway. We speak about eliminating the functions from the office that are not suitable to it. We speak about changing officers, and we speak about very strict and harsh public control over the operations of the organization that has such powers. There are multiple examples of that, and it should be noted that the Baltic states, well, at least as far as I know from their political governance practice, this transformation of their national security offices has been quite a success. Why am I referring to the Baltic states? Because these were the original departments of KGB, but they've managed to overcome this, and let's hope that Russia can overcome this too.
One follow-up from Nino Gelashvili from the Radio Liberty Georgian service, which I think basically is linked to what you were describing, and that is, do you think, and if Gary wants to comment, that would be of interest, and then I'll go to Andres. So the question is, how do you describe an idea or a person that would serve as an alternative to the present regime for the Russian society? There is, you can't transition from Putin's regime to a democracy in one jump. So what would be the first step to introduce Russians to democracy? Should there be maybe a new leader that will say that, or should new ideas, very new ideas, be formulated that would persuade the Russians? That's how I deciphered the question, Nino. And then we'll go to Andres, please.
Я хотел бы обратить внимание на важный аспект.
I would like to highlight an important aspect, which is described in my book. The expectations of building a united democratic Russia is not what cannot be implemented. This is deeply dangerous because Russia is a huge country and its territory is huge in this regard, and its population is relatively small. Due to that, in multiple Russian regions, people want different things. Some people want to have a European-type democracy. Others want to have the Central Asian democracy. Others want something different. Trying to bring them to a common vision is a task for a dictatorship, which is incapable of building democracy. Democratic Russia in general, I mean democratic in general, at the federal level, can only be a Russia that is multifaceted, where every of the regions is building the democracy that this region believes to be a democracy. And such a model should be engineered right starting from the balances and checks. That's the first step. Any single and undivided leader of opposition can bring Russia to democracy only if we see he is a saint with wings of an angel. If you don't see these two things, then there's only should be the system of balances and checks.
You have your hand up and you were very patient. Please, the floor is yours.
No, it's amazing discussion.
Thank you.
And I don't want to, to jump in, but just few comments on this, psychology of Russians, where, quite many Westerners do not believe that Russians can become democratic in one or another way, like Mikhail have said, or whatever, I always, I put, an article on what I call, our Lithuanian psychological complexes, Russian psychological complexes, that we have also, quite many of Lithuanians have some kind of those, such a mindset that Russia never will become a democracy. I'm saying this is a wrong approach, because if you look back, the argument is that Russia never was a democracy and so on and so on. I'm saying look back to beginning of 90s, when, for example, after, Gorbachev was coming to the end and he, sent his troops to Vilnius, TV tower. We remember that, Bloody Sunday, 14 people killed. And then in few days, in Moscow, there was a huge manifestation in support of Lithuanian independence and in support of democracy, with almost 1 million of Russians, The biggest demonstration whenever, had happened during recent, decades in Russia was a demonstration to support Lithuania and democracy in the whole, area. So that is, this is not disappearing. Such a genetic is not disappearing. It can be, how to say, arrested by, regime of Putin, but it does not disappear. So it's the question solely of time when it will appear back. Now somebody is saying, well, but look, Russia, the history always had, strong leaders and so on and so on. And that is why, history gives us a lesson that Russia cannot become a democracy. I'm always saying very simple way. Chinese also had no democracy, whatever. But Taiwan, with Chinese people, back in 1990, started to become a democracy, and very successful democracy. So it means that, all those historical evidences are not very rational ones. I do not see a big difference, in between of us and Russian people. The only difference is that, Russia is still suffering of its, what I call post-imperial nostalgia syndrome. And again, you can look into the history how much of suffering had France after Second World War, when their colonies started to fight for freedom, and so-called OAS organization, military underground organization in France, back in 1950s was going to destroy all the democracy in France, not to allow Algeria, to become an independent country. And only de Gaulle came and stabilized, the situation. He said, well, we need to save democracy. Let's get rid of Algeria. And that is the difference, in between of France and Russia, that France got de Gaulle, Russia got Putin at some, crucial moment, not de Gaulle.
Gary, please. Yes.
Can I jump in? Yes. Just following, what has been said about de Gaulle and France, and I think we should go even, further down the history timeline. It's not just about Putin. We should go back to 1991 when Soviet Union collapsed, but the empire still survived because clearly, we had many elements of Russia Federation proper that had the same aspirations as national republics. What was the principal difference between, let's say, Tatarstan and Azerbaijan, for instance? The only was that Azerbaijan had an infrastructure, or Armenia, or Republic of Georgia, or Moldova, and Tatarstan didn't. And there were many, issues, unresolved issues that were left, and somehow the formula was found, but it was still, based on the total control of a center. Though certain concessions were made to regional elites to make them feel more comfortable. So what we should consider as the first step towards democracy, and I think that using the word democracy is probably wrong because we're talking about the end of the empire. It's a dissolution of the empire and transformation of the empire into national state. National in good sense. National means that you have ethnicity being supplemented by nationality. Like Ukraine today is a national state. They have a Jewish president. They have many ethnic Russians, as Ukrainian generals, and you have Greeks and Hungarians, and of course, ethnic Ukrainians. All Ukrainians. So Russia has to move into the same direction, and it's clearly, it could happen only with the transformation of relations between the center and the regions, as Mikhail described very vividly in his book How to Kill the Dragon. And this is the top priority of the post-Putin government. So how to create conditions where the central authority will have very limited impact on the lives of people in the regions, both financially and economically and socially. Though we'll keep certain functions that the regions will be willing to give to the central authority. Whether it's doable or not and what form remains to be seen. We don't know the answer yet, but we believe this is the only way to secure this transformation of Russia into a modern state that could sustain the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Gary. Roland, you have a hand up again.
Yes, I want to come back to something that actually Gary and Mikhail said in the very beginning, that there may be some areas splitting away from what is today the Russian Federation, but the bulk of it can be saved, but only if it becomes a federation, which of course it is not. I mean, the term Russian Federation is cheating. Actually, it's a centrally organized dictatorship, and I do believe also that this question of is most of Russia going to hold together could be exactly the element that will force the next government of Russia to introduce constitutionalism and true federalism, which already automatically entails decentralization, and then you move on automatically to some kind of mutually controlling institutions, and at some point you will get to checks and balances. So at least in the minds of the next clique, next group of rulers, I could imagine such a process where, like, keeping most of Russia together becomes the trigger for a systemic change and a turn away from democracy and also the empire. And here's a question I have to my fellow speakers here. Now, there is a thesis, especially popular in the eastern flank countries of the European Union and NATO, that actually the Russian Federation, as it is today, is an empire. It doesn't execute imperial policies. It is an empire. So in other words, goodbye to empire means splitting up Russia, doing away with Russia as we know it. So, again, this comes back to this dichotomic choice that Kostya asked. But I just want to raise the flag here that this is a very, very popular thesis in many, many member states of the European Union.
Well, I think that if Gary or Mikhail want to briefly comment on that, they're welcome. But I think to some extent they already answered the question. Because I do have a couple of questions addressed specifically to you, Roland, I think by the participants. So Gary or Mikhail, if you do want to go back to this sort of Russia being an empire by definition, by genetics or not, just tell me. If you don't, then I'll ask questions of Roland. Roland, it seems like your question has already been answered. I have two questions to you. One is actually from Rebecca Harms, the member of European Parliament. She says that in her view, the message that Putin is getting is actually go for the wall. Because as Ms. Harms is saying, the West is giving Ukraine enough weapons to maybe not to be defeated, but not enough to win. And so why should Russian people or even parts of the Russian elite be interested in any transformation if in fact the West seems to be so afraid of Russia, of Ukraine winning the war? Or do you agree with this perception? Then I have another question too.
Yeah, hi Rebecca. Great to hear this question from you. Yes, I agree. I mean, we're still, or some of our policies still encourage Putin. And if, for example, Chancellor Scholz, until this very day, even after committing to delivering Leopard tanks, he still insists that only Ukraine cannot lose, Russia mustn't win. But he doesn't say Ukraine has to win this war. I think this is already an element where Putin will feel encouraged. And there are many other pundits, even much worse than Scholz. I mean, time and again, in newspaper op-eds in Germany, France, even in the United States in some corners, you see this leitmotif of saying, our interests are not Ukraine's interest. At the moment, we help Ukraine, but there will be a point in time when it is our interest to end the war as quickly as possible or not to permit an escalation into a nuclear exchange, whereas Ukraine has a natural interest in dragging NATO into the conflict and in escalating as much as possible, because that's the only way for Ukraine to defeat Putin. Now, this way of thinking is not dead. Actually, I would say it comes back in waves, and we will have to, I mean, right-thinking people will have to deal with this, and with patient arguments, and with always keeping in mind our interest and our fundamental interest in a victory of Ukraine. We should, I think, continue this debate, but it's going to be a long one, and I'm afraid you're right that Putin is encouraged by some of these voices.
Another question, or rather another small comment that I would like you to make, very small, really very short, because both Gary and Mikhail mentioned China in what they said, especially Gary, who has this very strong opinion. I know it, I've spoken to him many times, about essentially China being the next challenge. And if the world, quote unquote, loses the moment that Russia still can be said and dragged into or joined to the Western camp, there's going to be a playing field for China. Do you agree with that, A? And B, what do you think? Do you think that there is any kind of view of Russia in this kind of global China context in Western decision-making cycles?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, there's no love lost psychologically and culturally between Russia and China. That's fact number one. Number two, China still sees a lot of Russian ineptitude in this military campaign, felt surprised and it's not happy about the fact that Russia is now losing. But here we come to the decisive fact, which is number 3, which is Russia and China still have the same fundamental enemy, and that is the West. Actually, the enemy is larger than the West. It's free-thinking people. You know, it is constitutionalism, checks and balances, and free thought, as the Chinese Communist Party itself has formulated this. And as long as they have the same fundamental existential enemy, I think they will cooperate. And China is, as we heard in the last couple of days, delivering much more to Russia in terms of technology usable for military production than we thought. So this whole neutrality thing that China once in a while likes to display to the rest of the world is fake. China is when push comes to shove, China is interested in a Russian victory in Ukraine. But the fact that Russia is not doing too well and that Russia is civilizationally declining under Putin is actually not such a bad thing to some leaders, and to Xi Jinping especially, because it keeps Russia, it will bring Russia into a complete role of junior partner among the two.
Well, some people say it's already happened. Roland, thank you very much. I would like to direct a question from our good friend Marie Madras from Paris to both Mikhail and Gary. She is asking about the, well, if you wish, technical process of political process. What's going to happen when Putin is defeated? What mechanism will fill the void after Putin's defeat? Will there be a transitional government under international monitoring? Will it consist of both Russians inside Russia and people that are now in emigration? And I will add from myself, what should be the attitude to elements of the previous regime, to the bureaucracy that will remain in place, how it should be treated. So whoever wants to start, is it Mikhail or is it Gary?
Ничего. В случае скорейшего поражения Путина,
in case of sooner Putin's defeat, I'm not speaking about the defeat in a few years, if this conflict is extended, but in case it happens soon, then this will enable him to convince Russian society that he won. The propaganda capacity at hand of Putin will enable him to deliver this message. The other question is for how long this effect will last. In my opinion, this will last for a year. In a year, those national patriotic, in semicolon, forces interested in continuation of the war will understand that their interests suffered a lot, and they will prove to the Russian society that Putin lost and that the country lost because of him. Him to blame. In this situation, it will be very difficult for him to balance between the traditional opponent, which is the democratic opposition in the broad sense of it, then the regions, and again, the so-called national patriotic opposition. And it seems to me he will not cope with this. In this case, in 2024, but if he is defeated soon, will be forced to quit power by giving it to a successor, or losing power without a successor. And then the situation will develop, will aggravate, because the successor will either have to to reform and to base on a broader number of the Russian society and re-establish relations with the West, or the successor will lose power again. So that's the forecast of the events if Putin is military defeated in the nearest future.
Gary,
what would you like to add? And then I have one more question from one of the participants.
I think that the defeat in this war, which meant for us, it's a full liberation of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and Sevastopol, cannot be sold to Russian people as a victory. Crimea is a key. Dictatorships cannot survive without mythology. And staple of Putin mythology is Crimea. Krym nash, Crimea is ours. That was the consensus that helped Putin to jump or to move from the economic prosperity model into the more nationalistic approach back in 2014. So that's why I think the Putin's regime is doomed if Ukrainian victory is achieved in full, including liberation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Now, what to follow? And that's, that brings us back to the Western position, because when dictatorship is falling apart, there's a vacuum. You cannot replace Putin, who became a spine of the system, by someone else. There's always a chaos, the fight between different groups, and system has to find a new center of gravity to become stable. And considering the current economic situation, I just mentioned the numbers. The Russian deficit in January is 14 times the size of the same deficit a year ago. So the 35%, it's a drop in income. So Russian economy cannot survive for long even with these sanctions, which, by the way, could be even increased, will stay in place. Plus, defeat means that you will have the return of hundreds of thousands of defeated troops back to Russia, to the country with one of the highest level of wealth disparity in the world. It will plunge country into chaos. And here, what could happen? And that's Mikhail mentioned that the best hope is a split of the elites. And it's not about someone from Putin's entourage. This is not a Praetorian Guard that can take over power. The only stable government in Russia could be formed if people who are forming this government can restore relations with the free world. And that's why one of the components of Ukrainian victory is crucial: International Tribunal for War Crimes. The moment regional powers, all these thieves and crooks, corrupt governors, will recognize that they will be different from Putin's immediate inner circle, and they are no longer considered to be war criminals, they will look for compromises. They will look for the way out. And that gives me hope that we can find a formula to create relatively stable transitional government that will be based on the conditions that all the key demands have to be met: Ukraine liberated, compensation to Ukraine being paid, and main war criminals to be delivered to the international justice. I think it sounds like it's science fiction, but that's the only solution that, in my view, is a realistic one, because it takes into account the differences between the various groups that are playing a vital role in preserving Putin's regime. And I don't believe that the Praetorian Guard, some of the military groups, can stage a successful coup and create a government, because at the end of the day, they need resources. And Russia today not in the conditions where it can continue the war indefinitely without having a consensus of various groups, including powerful regions.
Gary, but an immediate follow-up to you and to Mikhail, because you both mentioned split inside the elites. You both mentioned, Mikhail actually specifically mentioned the national patriotic opposition. One of my colleagues here is a correspondent in Brussels for Lithuanian media, Evaldas Labanauskas, is actually asking about such armed formations like the Wagner Group, like the Kadyrov Praetorian Guard, and others who, in case the regime is weakened by defeat, will all vie for power. could it create a chaos that will be unmanageable and that will essentially prevent, even if there are willing elites, from transitioning to something that's more positive, more democratic, and more peaceful? Who wants to talk about the armed formations?
Let me jump in, because you mentioned Kadyrov. I think he's now in Dubai, yes? And we don't see much of Kadyrov troops, on the front line.
But so, you mentioned yourself returning.
Yes, but it says Kadyrov,
from the front and so
Kadyrov was preparing for any scenario after collapse of the Putin regime. It's more like thinking how to survive in this new situation. And I would not be surprised if he's now already ironing the green banner of Islam and will pretend to be a successor of General Dudaev, vying for independence of Chechnya and trying to build a great Chechnya there. Possible. Now, as for Prigozhin, I think he's a dead man, just dead man walking. The Russian generals will deal with him. I think he's still trying to play a role, and it's overblown. I think the Wagner group, will be the first target of Russian generals when the war is over. So I think, again, every system is trying to get into stability, and wars between militarized groups, makes sense when there's money that to split. Prigozhin became who he is because he had unlimited resources of Putin's state. This money is not yet depleted, but this war chest has been shrinking. It's shrinking as we speak. And soon Russia will not have enough funds, to pay for these adventures. And I believe that, again, this is the moment the free world clearly states that Ukrainian victory includes the creation of the International Tribunal. Every Russian general, every Russian bureaucrat, the governor, will start measuring his position towards this verdict. Should I, cross the red line and become a war criminal, or I should start looking for my own way out? That's how you create conditions for this to split the elites, and again, possibilities of Russia getting out of the inevitable chaos that will follow the collapse of Putin regime.
Mikhail, do you agree? Do you want to add something to what Gary said on this particular topic? Especially, I'm sure that chaos is on many people's minds.
Я не очень верю в...
I don't really believe in such a potential chaos, because the Russian society is relatively elderly. This is more like in the European tradition. And the aged population, people, senior citizens, are not guided by emotions. Therefore, yes, people will try to find an agreement, and we should consider that the people who have some military force in the back will be subjects, and those who don't, they will not. They will be subjects to the degree that they will be given the subjectivity, the subject status by those who have weapons. Unfortunately, Vladimir Putin put us down on the crystal basement. The government was initially established as an apparatus of violence. If you could exercise violence, you could be the government. Then the situation changed. Then the law appeared. Then the rule of law prevailed in countries. And then we started forgetting that the baseline is violence. And right now, we are recalled that the baseline is violence. And this is about Russia too. And I will stress again that the Russian society is relatively mature in terms of age and its mindset. And I would put a bet that people would try to find an agreement. 1990s prove that. There were places where there were fights, but these hotspots were in two places, in St. Petersburg and the aluminum factories. People were shooting each other there. The rest of them agreed peacefully and quite fast. So I think that's what is going to happen.
That you mentioned age. A few days ago, I think it was probably 2 weeks ago, I was taking part in a discussion about Iran, because my first sort of education is Middle East. Someone asked me why the Russians are not protesting as vigorously as the Iranians. And I said, you just look at the median age in Iran and in Russia. By the way, Iran is also becoming aged, but in Iran it's close to 30. In Russia it's more than 40. It's like 42 probably. That makes a big difference in terms of protests, in terms of including violent activity, which I think Mr. Khodorkovsky's mentioned, but that's just an aside. I think that following what you said, Mikhail Borisovich, because you mentioned the 90s, you mentioned what happened 30 years ago. The question from Michael Anderson is basically, why should the Russians and the leaders be more interested in democracy today, 30 years after the Soviet Union collapsed? And what changed during these 30 years that at the same time could, well, point us to the fact that Russians maybe will accept some kind of democratic transition? So what are the negative and the positive lessons from the last 30 years in your view? If you want to start, Mikhail, it's you. If Gary wants to start, then it's you, but definitely I would like you both to talk about it. Gary disappeared, so the floor is yours.
На самом деле изменения происходят.
In fact, changes have been happening, and I personally observe them. Gary, you're back, so maybe you will continue, and I'll be back.
Do you see the changes in Russian society, both positive and negative, probably over the last 30 years, how they will impact democracy making?
No, I have to agree with Michael, who said that Russian society is aged, both demographically and also politically. I think that's what happened in the late 80s and early 90s. There was a euphoria about the transition because it was clearly, that the communist regime, couldn't offer decent living standards, and people could see the difference between the free world and Soviet empire. And I think that's when the idea of democracy being an vital element of prosperity. Basically, we vote and we should live better than we lived before without voting, became a kind of a milestone in the minds of many Russians. I think now there's some sort of just this disillusionment because these 30 years they just they haven't brought it's what many people expected democracy would bring to Russia, and there were many confusions about the democracy as an institution. So I think there's a strong tendency to be part of the free world economically, and I think that's what should give us, as Michael said, a bridge, from the imperial illusions, imperial past into the national statehood that could help us to move Russia from totalitarian present into the democratic future.
Mikhail Borisovich,
да, так вот, добавлю, что...
Yes, I will elaborate more. In my understanding, democracy, to a large extent, means inclusion. Readiness of people not to delegate their lives, their fates to some leaders, but to use their delegates to design their life. And when, 25 years ago, approximately, I started discussing the issues of the necessity to transition to the parliamentary model in Russia, it should be noted that these issues were pleasantly discussed with me by the current members of Единая Россия, Single Russia political party. This thesis was considered as a marginal one. The society was not ready to accept it. They were saying, if not Yeltsin, then Putin, if not Putin, then who else? Today, we can see that at least in large cities, the idea of changing not only Putin, but the system, that transition to a parliamentary model is what should be considered seriously, is a common vision. In fact, what happens in the country's regions, the regional elites design that we can see today is certainly a more mature political process than what we could see back in 1990s, when Yeltsin just said, take as much sovereignty as you can. It seems to me that the Russian society is quite ready for the transition. And here, sociologically speaking, it is very important that the elder part of the Russian society supports those Putin's ideas to a larger extent, rather than the younger part of the Russian society. And this is clearly seen, this division, which surprises me. But those people who are aged 55 plus, they support war more than those who are 30 years minus. This is a proof. However, you are back from the Soviet Union. How can you support shelling of what you believe a part of your country? There's no rationale in it. So coming back, we can see that elder population, Putin, Patrushev, Ornikov, are elderly people, even Prigozhin, these senior citizens and generation. These are the people who suspend changes. Even changes of the generations will cause a significant change.
Actually, that brings us nearly to the close of the session of this webinar. And interestingly enough, you, Mikhail and Gary, you answered the question of our mutual good acquaintance Anastasia Shevchenko about changes over the last period, what you count on. That was the question that she asked, but you essentially answered it. So thanks a million. But the last question goes to someone who's very young, first and foremost of all. Secondly, he's from Bulgaria. He knows Russia very well too, and he's very active in helping Russian exiles, Pyotr Tanev. He's asking, what particular measures should the European Union take to support Russian democratic opposition exile? I would probably ask Gary, then Mikhail, then Roland, then Mikhail to answer this question, and we'll close with it because we are running out of time.
Yeah, very important question. We don't know the exact number of people who escaped from Russia over the last 12 months. The number definitely exceeded 1 million. Some say 2, some say more. We don't know, but this is a huge number. And it's not just number, it's quality of people who escaped. Successful IT managers, business people, those that could be considered, the creme de la creme of the nation. And they are now in no man's land. Because at the time of the war, you could be on one side or another, but if you are, escape from, one camp and not received on another, you are stuck in the middle. And the organization that we create with Michael last May, Russian Action Committee, had been arguing that European Union and other friendly governments, Americans, Canadians, Brits, have to consider offering these people opportunity to take a side. Basically, having a simple declaration that will give them a chance to denounce Putin regime, condemn the war, and accept Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty. And that will be a precondition for applying for any official status in the free world. We don't know how many of them will take this chance. Probably many, probably not. We don't know, but that will be, by the way, a test. But it's very important that we'll start creating what we have jokingly called our South Korea, if we consider Putin's Russia a big North Korea. And that, hopefully, if we will have hundreds of thousands of people who are willing to move, from Putin's regime into a new free Russia, though virtual Russia, online Russia yet, it's a chance to create conditions for peaceful transition later on, because that could become a core, a staple of a new Russian elite when Putin regime collapses. Again, it's very important that people will have to make this choice, and unfortunately, the free world is still not ready to take an initiative, and that's why the huge potential of these hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Russians that will be willing to move from Putin's dark reality into the free world. So they are, as I said, stuck in no man's land.
Roland, and then Mikhail.
Yeah. Again, I very much agree with all of this. I would add that, of course, Western governments, Western civil societies, even more, should particularly focus on the political opposition in exile and provide it with funding for media, social media, any way to still reach into Russia in Russian and from democratic Russians. Education, research, analysis, and of course, reaching out to those Russians who are in the West now, I think is crucial. And so I think we should do everything to support them. And I know that I'm at odds with some of my friends from Poland and the Baltic states here, but I think that to look below the bottom line, I think the advantages are much bigger than the disadvantages of this.
Mikhail Борисович, your comments on how the EU especially can help?
Хотел бы обратить внимание.
I would like to pay your attention on two things. Thing one, yes, these people, the people who are in exile, who left Russia, within the next 2 to 5 years, if regime changes in Russia, will be a significant asset that will make a significant contribution to the processes happening in Russia. These will be the people who will come back on a mass scale. Certainly, within 5 years, their number will be declining, but we are speaking about the current state of the things. The second aspect that we should not neglect: Western governments have colossal costs for their economies when they introduce sanctions, economic sanctions against Russia. It is clear that they are looking for the sanctions that would harm Putin more than the home economies of the European countries. But there's a backslash effect anyway. At that, we all agree that the key resource are people. And the situation when the damage to Putin can be comparable to all other sanctions, and at that it is possible to benefit your own economies. This means to attract people, professionals that Putin has been pushing away de facto from the country by attracting them not only. Well, there are sanctions imposed similar to all the rest, but there will be a beneficial side of the sanctions. Why this has not been done, or why this has been done so lightly, so weakly, it's difficult for me to say why. Maybe there are some domestic political reasons, but it seems to me that inclusion, engagement of the people who decide today to leave Putin's Russia is the issue that Western Europe could seriously address, adding it on top of what has been done today.
Thank you very much to all, to Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky, to Gary Kimovich Kasparov, and to Roland Freudenstein for being such excellent and disciplined panelists. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I thank you, and I'd like to pass the floor now to Andrius Kubilius. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Konstantin, and really thanks a lot to all the participants, to our panelists, Gary, Mikhail, Roland. Really, it was very, very interesting and very important discussion. My final remark. What we need to understand, in a very clear way. Transformation of Russia to what's normal, state, normal country, European type country, federal country, is not only the interest of Russian people. It's also should be interest of the Western community. And because that is what can change, totally the whole architecture of security and so on and so on. But in order to move, into that direction, I can repeat again, the Western community needs to have clear strategy how to assist Russian people in that, transformation. And that strategy should have, 3 periods of time. What we call, year before transformation, how to assist, for example, Russian political opposition, which is in exile. A lot of very practical questions. Second period, what we call, and what that terminology was used also by Mikhail and Gary in the article, day after. What kind of reforms, in Russia should be done immediately after the transformation. And the last period, what I call year after. How to assist stabilization of new Russian democracy, of transformed country with a Western assistance. What was perhaps missing, during Yeltsin time, and that is why, nostalgia in Russia back at the end of 1990s, prevailed against, fresh democracy, and that is why Putin came. So we need to learn also lessons. And I hope that, Putin, for me, it looks like, that he brought Russia to what I call a late Brezhnev, period. Different, of course, but very similar, stagnation, isolation, decline. We remember what had happened, as a consequence of that late Brezhnev period. Perestroika. Elite decided to change, in some way to bring some changes. Why not expect Perestroika 2.0? That is my conclusion. Let's do our best, really to help Russia and to assist Russian transformation. And that is, from my point of view, is realistic and possible. But it will depend on not only on Russian opposition, it will depend very much also on the Western community strategic thinking.
And the victory of Ukraine.
And the victory of Ukraine, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. And hope to see you again soon.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Yes,
We shall
bye-bye.
continue.